Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Bethany Servin, and I'm part of the marketing team here at UsableNet. This webinar is Why Shifting Left Isn't Enough, Embedding Accessibility in Your Organization. And I am going to go ahead and hand us off to our first speaker for his introduction, Darcy Cottrell.
Hi, everyone. My name is Darcy Cottrell. I'm the Vice President of Account Management at UsableNet. Fortunately, there's a brilliant picture of me here because my electricity, as luck would have it, just went out at my house. So I'm not on video. But really do appreciate everyone joining today. And in my 15 years at UsableNet, I've always worked on the account management side of our company, really with the objective of helping to shape and evolve accessibility strategies for companies across all verticals. So thanks again for joining today, and I'll pass it over to Charlie.
All right. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm Charlie Triplett. I am Director of Accessibility Operations here at NBC Universal. Most of my career has been spent as a designer developer and just gradually steered towards accessibility. So super happy to be here talking to folks about Agile and shifting left and different ways we can do that within the organization. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Charlie. We really appreciate you being here with us today. So, as way of an agenda today, we're going to first start by defining shift left, certainly a word we hear a lot out there. And then from there, we're going to have Charlie walk us through some of the bias we see in product goals, and then talk to us about why clear, testable acceptance criteria are essential. And then finally, we'll have a bit of a guided discussion from goals to delivery, making accessibility work, and have some live Q&A. So as we sort of get started today, at UsableNet, we hear a lot of teams talking about shifting accessibility left, but frankly, we're not always clear what that means. It seems as though every company has a slightly different interpretation of what that might mean. So today we're really digging into this concept and unpacking why this has been difficult to date for companies and ways for teams to begin achieving this moving forward. So with that in mind, Charlotte, maybe just to sort of get us started, when people say they're shifting left with accessibility, how do you define that?
Yeah, that is always a really good question. So here's the deal. Um, when we say we want to shift left, I think a lot of people say, "Oh, that means to design." They say, "Okay, well, we need the designers to adopt an accessibility mindset, and they need to have an accessibility first culture, and it's really about design." And that's true. Like you do want the designers to do those things. But really, accessibility can die a thousand deaths before it even gets to design. Because of my experience as a software engineer and a designer, and product manager, I really began to see that, hey, shifting left means different things to different people. And also, we kind of stopped too soon in that journey. And we really need to look holistically at the way software, whether it's web, iOS, or Android, gets made, and think about what shifting left actually means in that context.
That's great. Appreciate that. And can you tell us what the impact to the overall user experience is when this is done well by teams? I guess in essence, what is the ultimate benefit to our users when we appropriately shift left?
Yeah, this is my favorite topic. This is my keynote that I love giving places. It's a different talk for a different day. But look, when teams really adopt accessibility, they understand that they're not just designing for some sliver of the audience. They really understand that they're designing for everybody. Um, when we design for people with disabilities, we design a better product literally for everybody. This happens everywhere. You see this in architecture. So buildings that are built for people who are using a wheelchair or who are blind end up being a more comfortable experience for everybody. If you go to an Apple store, it's very easy and it feels very comfortable in those stores because they've accommodated multiple ways to move through that store and access the products. You see this in your day-to-day life. So many of us who work in the accessibility space are familiar with the concept of a curb cut. And if you haven't heard of that, maybe you're just coming into accessibility and you haven't learned all the analogies yet. I can look at my window right now and I can see down on the street next to the curb and the sidewalk that there is a ramp cut into that curb. If I pointed to that and said to somebody, "Hey, what's that ramp for?" They'd say, "Oh, well, that's for somebody using a wheelchair." But who else uses that ramp? We all do. Someone who is pushing a baby stroller uses the ramp. It's called a curb cut, by the way. Someone who is rolling a heavy cart, say they're the UPS person, they're delivering things. They use that ramp. Someone who is just walking down the street and they're distracted because they're texting on their phone, they use the ramp. All of these people had the same goal, which was to cross the street safely. But this feature that was put in place for people with disabilities actually made the street better and safer for everybody. And the same holds true in the digital space as well. There's plenty of documentation of that and instances of that where companies that really adopted the idea of like, hey, let's solve this problem for people with disabilities, created a better product, generated a brand new market that didn't exist before. It is incredible what a innovation driver that accessibility is for companies that are willing to pick it up.
That's great. Really appreciate that. And we love a good analogy or metaphor at UsableNet, so very much appreciate it. And with that, now, Charlie, I will pass it over to you to walk us through your material.
Let's start this conversation about cognitive bias and agile and the way we produce software with where most accessibility conversations end. Yeah, we're on a condensed timeline, so accessibility is super important to us. We really want to make our product accessible, but we have to launch on time. This is where most conversations about accessibility products end. And this is the conversation we want to avoid, but I think it's one we've all been in if you're working in the accessibility space. Okay, so this conversation is more about someone who is lacking certain resources than someone who is ignoring accessibility. This conversation is telling you about the unspoken values of the organization, and it's telling you how to affect big change at your organization if you listen and decide to be curious. I know I've been on the receiving end of this conversation, and it's not a fun one to have, but we can work with this. There's things we can learn from this and things we can do to get out of this cycle of having this conversation when it's too late. So we're going to talk about using Agile to overcome cognitive bias and just make our products better for everybody. Notice this is a lowercase Agile, lowercase a Agile. And Agile comes in different sizes, flavors, and methods, and that's okay. Your Scrum might not call what they're doing Agile. They might say that they're using Kanban. They might say they're using Safe Agile or Lean. It really doesn't matter. If you are a program manager who's interested in accessibility, this talk is going to be for you. If you're a product manager, a designer, a developer, or a tester, this talk is for you. If you're a seasoned accessibility expert, this talk is for you. Or if you wandered in on this talk to, I don't know, keep your Slack status green online, you made a good decision and we're glad you're here. So I want you to understand, I don't come from a program management background. I've been focused on design and engineering for most of my career. Gradually, I shifted, though, towards accessibility. Starting around 2014, I had folks come into my career that really made me question and they challenged the way that I thought about accessibility as this kind of nice to have. I used to be one of those engineers that would say, well, yeah, accessibility is important, but we have to think about the average user here. cringe when I think about saying that, but that's who I was. As I began to learn more and more about accessibility during my time at the University of Missouri, during my time at Veterans United Home Loans, I really began to see accessibility as not just this additional thing, but a path to making products better for everybody. Gradually, my work has shifted away from building stuff. I'm still engineering things with some open source products like Atomic Accessibility. Um, but I am now director of accessibility operations at NBC Universal. So that line is starting to go the other direction. I'm starting to think more about enterprise program management, which is not where I thought I'd be if I go back to 2014, 2019, any of those places. Um, so I'm someone who's very comfortable with designers and developers, and I know that we have to talk about this statement. Let's talk about what my presentation is not about. Too often, people in accessibility who would call themselves experts, and they've been doing this a lot longer than I have. They will say, who's responsible for accessibility? Everybody. And well, okay, that's not wrong, but that's kind of a terrible way to introduce accessibility, because when people introduce anything where everybody is responsible in a company, a great wave of relief sweeps over the room, because we all know that if everybody's responsible, nobody's responsible. And it's important to recognize that unless you have a company where you just have like one lone wolf 10x engineer working in a basement by themselves, software development is team work. It's work performed by a team. And everyone has a specialized role. Not everyone can be responsible for everything, but people are accountable for their role. That's why they were given that job. There was a role to fill, and they stepped up and said, hey, I'm good at that. Let me do that. Pay me money, and I will do that job. Software is about team and work. So today we're going to cover these three topics. We're going to look at how agile teams do the work. Teams do the work. How hidden cognitive bias hurts accessibility. And we do have to go on a bit of a journey to get there, but it's going to be worth it, I promise. And we're going to look at how to use existing tools to overcome that hidden bias. Now, if you want to have an impact on digital teams, you can't be this person. Someone who says, well, I really don't understand all that agile Scrum Kanban stuff. That's just for the nerds. I just need them to have an accessibility first mindset. I need to have an accessibility culture. Look, it doesn't matter if you're somebody from legal compliance or security or marketing. Modern software, whether it's built in web, iOS, or Android, is built on the currency of a team that's working, and they're probably working in some form of agile. That's their currency and how the software gets built. Agile, one way to explain it, is just a method of working that delivers value to the customer quickly and predictably. And I don't like reading slides, but this one's important to understand, especially that word predictably. Because predictability is very important to every business that we are in. Businesses like predictability. There's kind of an idea that entrepreneurs, like taking on risk. No, they don't. Entrepreneurs want predictability. They want to know what the plan is. They want to have a long-term vision. And Agile helps us do that. So one way to quickly understand Agile, though, is to understand what Agile isn't. And so you might be familiar with the concept of waterfall software development. Okay, waterfall kind of makes sense. You gather all the requirements for whatever you're building. Then you design and deliver a system to meet those requirements. What could be simpler? Okay, so if you're making an e-commerce website, you find out all the things you're going to sell, how they're going to be sold, how they're going to be priced, how the orders are processed, how things are shipped, how things are returned, and you build the perfect system based on perfectly gathered requirements to do all of that. The problem is that along the way, you keep discovering new requirements. Oh, we learned that we're selling a new class of product next week. Oh, we found out that shipping to the United Kingdom is now different because of Brexit. Oh, we found out that some country in the world has put tariffs on everything, and we need to change the price based on that dynamically. Okay, each stage actually takes way longer in waterfall than it was intended, and the final product never looks as elegant or works as well as anyone hoped. This kind of project, working in waterfall, destroys the morale of teams who are working on it because it feels like it never ends. There's always one more problem, one more hiccup that has to be dealt with. And what gets delivered is not what anybody wanted. More importantly, it is not predictable because you can't gather all system requirements perfectly, and you can't design the perfect system because you will never have all the system requirements. It's not predictable, it's not fast, and that's a problem for businesses. That's why so many companies have adopted agile methodologies. So this is an oversimplistic view of how agile works, but for our purposes, it's enough to understand. With agile, if you don't know how agile works, we basically put the people who come up with those system requirements, who are the people who decide what the application needs to do, and we're going to put them in the same room with a small team of designers and developers and testers. This person who comes up with the requirements, they're called a product owner. And they work directly and communicate directly with this small team. Now, they work in what are called sprints. Those are usually 2 weeks. Some companies might do 1 week, 3 week, whatever. It doesn't really matter. But the process looks very similar to this. They have a backlog of work, which is all of the work they intend to do long term. They're going to pull projects out of that backlog that they can accomplish in the next sprint. So let's just talk in 2 week sprints. That cross-functional team is then going to work to solve all the problems that are in that 2 weeks of work and deliver value to the customer in that 2 weeks. And at the end of that, they're going to review how it went. And then they're going to do it all over again every 2 weeks. And something magical happens when you do that. When you deliver something of value to the customer in short-term segments, you feel like you're part of a team that listens to your feedback. You maintain a sense of momentum, a sense of progress. You do expect things to change somewhat. You expect there to be some small surprises along the way, but that's okay because we can make a small adjustment in the next sprint. So over the course of a quarter, there will be usually about 6 sprints. Now, you can't be this person either once you learn about sprints. Okay, if you learn that like, oh, the sprint is ending on next Wednesday, great. Make this team start doing accessibility in the next sprint. Okay, we cannot have the impact that we want to have if we don't understand how the sprint actually works. So remember, there was a backlog of all those tasks, and we have to understand where that backlog of tasks came from, how that came into being. And that is something that happens every quarter, and it's called PI planning, or program e-commit planning. The quarterly planning is exactly what it sounds like. Our cross-functional team sits down and very intensely for about a week reviews how the last quarter went. You know, what do they want to change about the last quarter? What went well? What do they want to keep doing? What do they want to stop doing? They coordinate work with other teams. So maybe there's a team devoted to the shopping cart system, and maybe there's a team that's devoted to payments, and they're focused on product pages. They've got to talk to each other. They collaborate heavily with the other product teams. They start writing something called product goals, and we're going to talk today a lot about product goals. And they also write acceptance criteria for every piece of work that's added to the backlog. This backlog contains everything this team believes that it can deliver every 2 weeks for the next 3 months, and they mean it. It's important to understand that they have committed to this work. They have all decided that, yes, we can accomplish these tasks in the next quarter. They spent intense days planning it. Budgets have been allocated. Contractors are lined up. You have to understand they are not interested in changing their goals mid-quarter. That is not on their roadmap to completely blow up everything and do something else like accessibility if they've never heard of it. So now we can start to talk about the heart of the matter. If we look at this process of PI planning and sprints and understand it and start to see it for what it is, we can use it as a tool. Agile is just a tool. It serves teams, and tools matter. Agile creates some things that are very useful to us. It creates a very collaborative work model where people don't just coordinate, they collaborate. Okay, so they don't just coordinate and throw things over the wall to the next team. They actually talk to each other. They coordinate, they collaborate. They write these things called product goals. Product goals are super important because it aligns everyone to make sure we're all building the same thing with the same goals in mind. That's really hard to do at scale, but Agile lets us do that. And they write acceptance criteria so that everyone understands what completing each little job means. So how can we use this to make our products more accessible? Really, this is my favorite quote right now. It's from Buckminster Fuller. He was a futurist, inventor, decades and decades ahead of his time. He had this quote that I just love, and it's really influenced the way that I've approached accessibility, and I hope you find it useful too. He said, "You can't change the way people think. All you can do is give them a tool, the use of which will change their thinking." You can give them a tool, the use of which will change their thinking. Why is that so important? Okay, so I'm going to say something, and some of you aren't going to like it. Ooh, we just got to have an accessibility mindset. That's what we need around here. That's what's going to change everything. Okay, look, people don't come to work to mindset. They don't come to work to culture. I don't know how to measure accessibility mindset. I don't know how to measure accessibility culture. I mean, there are sociologists who know how to do that, but I don't know how to do that, and you probably don't either. I can't measure those things. An accessibility mindset is not something that you can formulate a plan for. But what we can do is we can come back to that PI planning and talk about product goals and really understand what product goals are, what kind of tool they are, and how we can use those. So when teams write product goals, again, they're aligning everybody on what the goal of whatever it is they're doing. And I want you to understand the concept of product goals is not something unique to accessibility. This is not some new idea that I'm introducing for the first time. Okay, the 2020 Scrum Guide featured a number of updates. I think the most important for our purposes is the product goal. It's important to understand, again, this is not something new. It's documented, and they already do this in some form, whether they are safe, lean, agile, Kanban, whatever, they have a goal that they are moving towards, and it's defined. A good product goal looks something like this. We're going to do something for the user or the business with this purpose. We're going to do something for people for a specific purpose, right? That's a good product goal. Okay, again, slow down. This is not what we're doing. We can't just yell at the developers until they make accessibility their goal, because we heard about product goals. We have to understand where product goals come from, because developers don't write the product goal. It's the product owner that's responsible for the product goal, not just writing the product goal, but also communicating that goal to the team. And every sprint, they review progress towards the product goal. They discuss it at every single sprint review. They are the ones who are responsible for writing this down, for communicating and reviewing it. This is why not everybody is responsible for everything. So knowing that, and what we talked about of how we can deconstruct product goals, what's missing from these goals? Okay, let's look at these goals here for a second. So we want to improve onboarding to decrease customer support calls. All right, that's a really good goal. I think that's probably in every single software team's backlog right now in one respect or another. We want to streamline the online shopping experience to increase revenue. That is a great goal. We want to collect surveys to refine recommendations and increase purchase satisfaction. Oh, such a good goal. Increase accuracy of search to improve discoverability. These are really good goals, but there's something missing here. Okay. And based on the last couple of slides we looked at, you might say, well, these slides are missing people. Okay. And you'd be right. But there's something else that's not exactly missing, but hidden in these goals. And that's this. Another goal that's unstated creeps in to these goals. And it's not written down anywhere, but you better believe it's there. On time and on budget becomes the overriding value by which teams unconsciously prioritize this work. This is an unconscious hidden bias, and it happens to us all, okay? it's way more difficult to get accessibility into a conversation where we're going to improve onboarding to decrease support calls on time and on budget, than if we had a goal that was written differently. And we'll talk about that in a second. But essentially, that additional goal, if you're trying to come in to the team that's improving onboarding and say, hey, we've got to have an accessibility mindset, we've got to put accessibility into this thing, that feels like something that's going to derail that hidden, unspoken goal of on time and on budget. If I come to this PO of any of these goals and say, hey, we need to think about accessibility, they're unconsciously valuing time and budget. This accessibility issue sounds incompatible with time and budget. So that's how we end up at this conversation. Yeah, we're on a condensed timeline. Accessibility is super important to us, but we got to ship this on time. And then we'll come back to accessibility, I promise. And they never do. You know why? Because it's never written into the goals. So those goals we just looked at generate this conversation. Because those goals leave out people of any type, they don't explicitly state that we value creating good UX for everybody, including people with disabilities. You know, this conversation that's up on screen right now doesn't value people. It values time and budget. And I don't know about you, but budget and time have never used my websites, but people sure did. And this is just an aside. This is just something that triggers me, but I keep it to myself. I'm going to share it with you today. You know, have you ever come across a team that wasn't on a tight deadline? You know, when the team comes up and they're like, oh, well, we're on a tight deadline. We have to launch this on. Oh, wow, you're so special that you have a tight deadline. I've never seen that before. A team with a tight deadline. Wow, I didn't know that was a thing. Okay, I've got that off my chest. Let's move on. So look, the goals are affected by our values, whether they're written explicitly or not. That product owner is telling you what the company values, but they're not saying it out loud. Goals are all of those things that we manage, checking things off the list, submitting the ticket, closing the story, deploying the package. But values are how we prioritize that work. And our values are often based on unconscious hidden biases. So with this understanding of Agile, as brief as it was, we can start to see where we might be able to have a huge impact, but we have to understand hidden bias. And let's explore this for a second. So look, bias is pretty neat. It's actually a series of shortcuts that our minds take that can often help. Like bias can help us a lot, but it can also hurt. And I'm not going to get into the UX taxonomies of cognitive bias and available heuristics. If you're a UX researcher, you're like, I'm already an expert on this, Charlie, and that's awesome. Great. We're not going to do that. We're going to go into general terms so we understand why we're doing what we're doing. But look, not all bias is bad. We have some shortcuts in our brain that come from reasonable fears. So for example, should I walk down this dark, scary alley at 1 o'clock in the morning? I just moved to New York. Did you know there actually aren't any alleys in New York? I think there's like one alley, like in the movies. There's always like, ooh, bad things happen in the alleys. There's no alleys here because you couldn't have an alley. It would be too valuable real estate. Everything's been built on. I'm sorry, I had to go off there. But look, should I walk down this dark alley? No, there's things just internally in your biology that tell you that you should not walk down that dark alley. And that's probably helpful. Okay. But this happens at work too. So this feature feels similar to something that we built last year that failed. Okay, and someone proposes it again. You have a bias towards that feature that says, I think we should really think about this before we go down this dark alley of this feature. Okay, those are examples of biases being helpful, but biases can also hurt. So we're naturally biased to think that bad things won't happen to us. So I hear this a lot. Like, I don't think we'll be affected by a regulatory complaint or an ADA complaint. Nobody else really seems worried, so we're just not worried about it. And that's because we're naturally biased to think that bad things are not going to happen to us. We're biased to think that things that we've seen repeatedly must be true. So Google does it this way, so it must be fine. Or all the other companies do it this way, it must be fine. We're also biased to think that people or companies we admire are right. Okay, so I don't know if you're familiar with the term HIPPO. It means highest paid person's opinion. You've all had the experience of being in a room where everybody in the room on the team said, yeah, we think option B is definitely the best answer. Option B is the way we should go. But then the hippo walks in, the highest paid person, and says, well, I think I like option A. And immediately was like, yeah, option B, option A, that's definitely where we should be. Option A, yeah, that's a really good call. It's often the hippo that doesn't think that you'll be affected by regulatory complaint, or the hippo who thinks that they saw something that Google does and they think that it's really cool and we should do that. Okay, here's where I wanted to get to. We can write better product goals. Let's look at these goals in a way that actually includes people and accessibility. So we can accessibly improve onboarding for all people to decrease support calls. This is a better conversation that we can have with this team now. If our goal is to include everyone, and the other decision is defining who we're excluding. Are there customers we really hope will have to call customer support? You know, if we're trying to streamline the online shopping experience to accessibly increase revenue from all customers, is there customer revenue we don't want from people? The answer to that is no. Are there people that we don't want to visit our online store? No, that's not a thing. There's nobody that anybody's trying to exclude. These goals change the conversation a lot. And the PO, the product owner, must communicate this as the goal. That's their job, is to communicate this is our goal to the team. And of course, there is still the hidden goal here of doing this on time and on budget. Okay, that doesn't go away. That's always there. But look, here's the secret sauce. If a team has adequate training and resources, and their goal is to accessibly improve onboarding for all people, to decrease support calls, and they still turn out something that is not accessible, you don't have an accessibility problem anymore. What you now have is an organizational delivery problem. They don't need accessibility help. They need training on how to deliver. They may need expert resources from an agile coach, but for whatever reason, this team is not delivering on their goals. It's important to understand that not every accessibility problem is an accessibility problem. Sometimes it is a capacity problem. Sometimes it's an expertise problem of people who just need dev coaching rather than accessibility training. But look, here's the thing. If they have the right goal and they still can't deliver, you have a different problem to solve, and that's helpful information. The goal is to get to this conversation with the product owner and everybody that we work with in the accessibility space. The notion that we have to launch accessible products on time. We want this to be the conversation that we have. And the way we do that is we write better product goals. Okay, so let's go back to that PI planning and examine acceptance criteria. If you've heard me talk about accessibility just about anywhere else, you've heard me talk about acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria are so important because they eliminate confusion about outcomes for every item in that backlog. This is often the problem in communication in any field, is miscommunication, because we throw things over the wall, we don't communicate, we don't collaborate like we should. But again, who writes the acceptance criteria? Well, it's not the designers, not the developers or testers. Again, it's the product owner. Now, they often write acceptance criteria with a little help from the accessibility subject matter expert. They might have help from their dev team, from their designers, but they're the ones who are writing the acceptance criteria. They're the ones who are responsible for it. The reason why acceptance criteria work is because it tells us what the outcome is in a very testable way. Without acceptance criteria, it's like you're trying to record a song and everyone, has a copy of the sheet music for their instrument, but you don't tell the drummer what the words are to the song or what the vibe of the song is or what the song is about. You're not going to create something beautiful and harmonious that way. Acceptance criteria gives software teams the ability to really understand what it is they're trying to do. So let's just look at a simple example. These are called Gherkin acceptance criteria, and they have this following format that, given that something is true, when I do a thing, then a thing happens. So given that I'm on a screen with a checkbox, when I use the tab key to move focus to a checkbox, I see focus is indicated. Easy. There's nothing ambiguous about that. I can understand that. Then when I use the spacebar to activate the checkbox, I see that the state is changed. So it's checked or unchecked. That's cool, right? There's no ambiguity to this. Designers, developers, QA testers, the product owner, everybody can understand this. And acceptance criteria can be added for keyboard, screen reader, mobile screen reader, anything you want, you can write acceptance criteria for. Condensed versions of acceptance criteria also exist in table format. Some people prefer this format, but look, the web content accessibility guidelines are amazing as a standard of success criterion. But, here's kind of a gathering of paraphrased WCAG criteria for that same checkbox. This is kind of what that would look like if you tried to put it all together. And keep in mind, this is a summary, not even the complete success criterion. And not all of these are applicable all the time. And you have to think about conformance levels, A, AA, AAA. These are open to interpretation. A developer can read it one way, a QA tester may read it another. And nowhere in here does the web content accessibility guidelines explain that the spacebar is what activates the checkbox and the tab key focuses it. You have to dig pretty deep into other documentation to learn that. WCAG is necessary, and it is important that we understand WCAG, but we shouldn't expect every developer and every tester to become an expert on the web content accessibility guidelines. I know that's heresy for some of you. Now, where you can get criteria, you can scour WCAG and write out all the success criteria that apply to what the team is building. And I see teams that do that, and they are very successful in what they set out to do. The ARIA authoring practices guide has tables that lay out acceptance criteria. The tool that I built, atomically.com, is what I've been working on for about a year now. And it includes some training, design, iOS and Android criteria, and web criteria. It includes all of the acceptance criteria for just about anything you'd want to build. All right, so we've got a couple of extra minutes here. So I'm going to throw in a bonus agile tool that we can use to deeply affect accessibility in organizations, and that's called team agreements. So that doesn't really factor into PI planning or sprints, but team agreements are another tool that's available to us because that cross-functional team, they sit down and they agree on the way that they operate at a team level as a team. Each team should have a team agreement, and whether it's cross-functional with designers and devs or purely developers and testers, and they do review and update this on a regular basis. But team agreements generally include working hours and communication. So especially if they're distributed across time zones, hey, what hours are we all going to be available? It defines things like their work culture and how they like to collaborate and where they need focus time. It defines the tools and methods they're going to use, what software are they going to use, or how they're going to trade files. But it also contains these last two things that are super, super interesting. Definition of ready and definition of done. Okay. So the definition of ready is how teams decide whether or not something that they're pulling from the backlog is actually ready to work on. And they can define this. And if we work with teams to define a better definition of ready for accessibility, we can have a huge impact on what they do. Because their definition of ready can include that, hey, the product goal has to be inclusive. We don't accept product goals that don't include accessibility and people. They can include things like we require any design artifacts need to be annotated with headings and alt text and things like that. They can require that the UI story includes accessibility acceptance criteria before they're ready to work on it. All of these things, the product goal, the annotations, the acceptance criteria, these are all things that teams are fairly familiar with. These are not new ideas for them. And all of these work to reduce the ambiguity of the task that they have at hand. Lastly, definition of done is just, hey, how do we decide that work is done? And one of those definitions could be acceptance criteria can be demonstrated to the PO. That's a very common definition of done. And if you're doing that for screen reader, for keyboard, for mobile screen reader, you can be pretty sure that this feature that they're launching is accessible. So, what we covered today, we looked at how agile teams do the work. We looked at how hidden cognitive bias creeps in and creates barriers to conversations that we want to have, to the work that we want done. And we looked at how to use existing tools to overcome that bias, product goals, acceptance criteria, and team agreements. We can use all of these tools to change the way people think. And I think it is way more effective to give people tools that change the way they think rather than uh, layering levels of bureaucracy and additional gates on top of them. If we can change the way people think, we can get the results that we want and ultimately make our products better for all people. So, with that, I will say thank you. Please do connect with me on LinkedIn if you like. And I am super happy to take on any questions that folks might have. All right, so I will leave this up for a second if you're sitting there with your smartphone, or you can look me up on LinkedIn. I'll be around. Thank you.
That was awesome, Charlie. Thank you. Thank you. I know I'm a bit biased, pun intended, but I took a lot from that. I think one of my favorite lines was that um, budget and time have never used my website. So I'll just get the conversation going a little bit, and then certainly want to hear from the audience. But so now let's take a very standard situation, right? With some of the people out there, they're working on a team. They have a e-commerce website that's up and running, and they've been tasked with making it more accessible. What are some ideas for what you would suggest people do as a first step to start with this, right? Keeping in mind we know that we need to plan in advance, but how would you suggest somebody get started in the right direction?
Yeah. Well, okay. So the first thing is you have to know where you are. So conducting some audits, some automated scans, get an idea of where you actually are. In aviation, they have this concept in an emergency of aviate, navigate, communicate. First of all, you have to, make sure that you're keeping the plane in the air in an emergency, but then you have to start navigating, and you navigate by figuring out where you are. So a audit mixed with some automated testing is a great place to start because you want to know, okay, well, what is the actual situation? What is the scope of work that might need to be done? Once you have that, you kind of have two different projects. You have a remediation project of, hey, here are all the things we need to fix. But then you start to get into, well, here's how we're going to move things forward and make better products in the future. And so that's the first step is where are we? What's it going to take to fix what we already have? But what are the adjustments we're going to make moving forward so that we don't wind up with this backlog of things to remediate?
That's awesome. And my second question would just be, ha- have you seen a team in your experience really get this right? And if so, what are they doing differently that have really made them successful at this?
Yeah, you asked a good question. So the teams that really get this right permanently, you might have a team that really digs into accessibility for like a quarter, and that feels really good when you're working in the accessibility space. But then the next quarter, their priorities all change, and they get you just don't hear much from them. That happens sometimes, but the teams that really dig into this are the teams that latch onto the idea that accessibility is not just the right thing to do, but it's the best thing to do. Like they adopt that analogy about the curb cut. They recognize that, hey, by making this accessible, we're making the best product that we can for all of our customers. Those are the teams that really make that turn, that really, and they stay there. And that is super satisfying to work with those folks because they ask better questions. They really dig into the work. They're doing some UX research, and they're just seeing their work as something that's important, not just to, some sort of average user that doesn't exist, but they recognize that accessibility is this catalyst for them of just innovation and making better products. That's the biggest marker. If you can convince people of that, they will start to become self-motivating.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. And yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. I think we all tend to have a bit of preconceived notions and biases around the importance or value of something. 15 years ago when I started net and we were focused on mobile web optimization, and we would talk to companies every day that would say, why would I ever need my website to be usable on a BlackBerry or a device? People aren't on those. That's and literally hang up the phone. So I think it's and just look at the proliferation of AI. So I think it's all important for us to recognize that we don't know where this is all going, right? But what we do know is that user experience, customer experience is really the last major area that you can differentiate yourself within business, right? How optimal is your experience for your customers? And everything we're talking about here with good accessibility is simply good usability. So super, super insightful. With that, Bethany, would love to open it up to any questions from the audience.
Okay, great. We have a few questions here. This one is from Jennifer for Charlie. You mentioned adequate training and resources. That is one of the challenges that's not always within our control if we are in the trenches of trying to implement accessibility. How do we advocate and influence the need for time for training, resources, and compensation for making the shift to implement accessibility?
Yeah, you've asked a good question. So, um, you do need to have those things adequately in place, right? Like you can't, even if you have the right product goals and you have acceptance criteria, you still rely on the teams to, do the work, to do the things, and they have to do it correctly. And those things help them do it correctly and not, spin off in the wrong direction. But they do have to, learn about keyboards. They do have to learn a little bit about screen readers. They do have to learn a little bit about high contrast settings and things like that. So, how do you get that in there? And the answer is leadership buy-in. You have to have a program that has access to leadership, and leadership can say, "Hey, teams, you will spend X amount of your budget on spent on time training." That can be a challenge, and I have dealt with that challenge in ways that were both not just about funding, but also in terms of like, well, we can't legally ask these people to complete our training because they're a contractor, and that represents such and such conflict. Training is a big topic, but it starts with that leadership buy-in and expectation that leadership thinks that this is important, that we do this. Um, I don't know a better answer than that leadership buy-in, because if you're talking to a team that has not been told by their leadership that this is important, that that time spent on this is important and the budget is important, team's not going to do it. They have to hear that from above, and we are often in accessibility not in the place of doling out bonuses or budgets or things like that to teams. And so it really has to come from leadership. There's not a this one weird trick sort of way to make that happen.
And I think just to add to that, right? I mean, companies are typically consumed with three priorities: making money, saving money, and mitigating risk, right? So how can you anchor onto some of those overall objectives when you're convincing leadership? Hey,
Yeah.
by focusing on accessibility and giving us the right training and tools, it's going to help us reduce our overall risk, avoid litigation, et cetera. So, it's not always exactly aspirational what we're tying these needs to, but if it results in getting you the tools and training you need, then all the better.
Yeah.
So we did have another question that was, how do you get buy-in from leadership to ensure accessibility is more than a mindset? And Darcy, you just answered that, but Charlie, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's it. Helping them to understand legal risk, the financial benefits, the benefits to brand. Um, but when you're talking to leadership, I will say this: bring it up in terms of your company values. I know that like every company has company values. And when you're an employee, you feel pretty far removed from these lofty values that talk about, you know, doing the right thing for the customer and ethics and those sorts of things. But people in high leadership positions take those values very seriously. Um, if you can show them that, hey, accessibility fits into our values and not making our products accessible to people with disabilities violates our values as a company. That is something leadership will surprisingly latch onto. Um, that's that's kind of the only thing I can add to that, because not everybody who is in leadership only cares about money. That's not why they got where they were. I mean, sometimes that is okay. If you're like a hedge fund manager, yeah, that's you. But if you are, senior VP of product or design or whatever, you got there by being an empathetic human being that cared about people. So it's not that big of a leap to bring accessibility up in terms of values that they adopted and as part of this company.
I do want to make a quick plug that we have had Charlie on before for another webinar where he gave us a strategy on how to get leadership buy-in. So I will include that as a link in the follow-up email. It's a good one. Um, and let's do another question. We've got 5 minutes left. You mentioned that if everybody is responsible for accessibility, then nobody is responsible for accessibility. Can you elaborate on why that is?
Yeah. Uh, Software engineer here, lazy. Um, that's how it is. Like whenever you hear that everybody is responsible for, I don't know, some sort of legal compliance, or everybody is responsible for building the right culture, you know that there's nothing specifically that anyone's going to ever ask you to do. Like there is nothing that's going to be role specific in that request. There's nothing that anybody's ever going to come to you and say, hey, we asked you to complete XYZ training by the end of the quarter and you haven't done it. Okay. So yeah, when everybody's responsible, you know that nobody's actually responsible for that. It's a nice thought. It's not wrong, but it's not helpful and it's not the way we work.
And I'll just add to that as well. As you begin to think about building champions and momentum behind accessibility within your organization, we've had tremendous success working with some of our clients in bringing a number of these different people from product owners to project management, QA to development to executives who are ultimately responsible for these teams, bring them into a room and have everybody turn their monitor off or close their eyes and work to navigate your website. It's very easy to turn voiceover on a computer, use your keyboard navigation and have people actually experience this. So I encourage people to really try and do this as in a way for people to have that sort of aha moment. It really does take experiencing what you put all of your time and effort into making better, and then recognizing that it doesn't work. It doesn't work for such a huge swath of the population. So if you ever do get that opportunity, definitely encourage it.
And since we only have 1 minute left, I'm just going to open it up to Charlie and Darcy for, first of all, thank you so much for your time today, but see if you have any final thoughts for us.
Um, you know, uh, I did see I guess it wasn't exactly about this, but there's plenty more questions in the chat. One thing I will say is that burnout is a huge topic in the accessibility space right now. And what I have learned uh, is that in the same way that sprints give teams a sense of momentum and progress, momentum and progress is what keeps you from feeling burned out. So your accessibility program can do things that give you a sense of momentum and progress. If you're willing to work with teams and spend time with them and just show them a better way. But too much of the time, the accessibility program sits up here and tries to sprinkle accessibility onto teams from on high and gets really frustrated when everybody doesn't accept the programming. And that's, I think, where a lot of the burnout in our space comes from. There's other places too. But integrating with those teams, working with them, being part of their successes, I find incredibly motivating and keeps me out of that burned out space. And I hope that other folks can find that too.
Yeah, and I just want to thank Charlie again. My power has now come back on right at the end, but we really appreciate Charlie you giving us some of your time. You've been a wealth of knowledge and inspiration for me and a lot of us at UsableNet over the years. So thanks for sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Darcy. And thank you, everyone who joined today. We appreciate you spending time with us. Thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and conclude the webinar. Thank you.